Welcome back, horror hunters, crypt creepers, and scream queens. It is I, Gavin Tripplehorn, aka Ghoulish Gavin. And I must start with an apology. The last podcast ended rather abruptly. Elle said it was a great cliffhanger and created lots of engagement, but I don't think my personal trauma should act as a catalyst for you to listen next time. But you're all probably wondering what was in the film can, and I promise you it is not for those with weak stomachs. The good news is it did contain a reel of film. The bad news is it was clutched in the vice-like death grip of a severed, decomposing hand. Now, I've seen many horror movie props. I even own a fair few, and you get to know the real from the fake. And this hand was very, very real. And the freshly released stench from the broken film can was not one of latex and rubber, but death and decay. No one really tells you what to do when someone sends you a severed hand, other than quickly losing your lunch. Elle managed to keep it together a lot more than her old man and snapped a few pics, and then called the police. They arrived quickly and took a lot of fingerprints and had a lot of questions. Have I got enemies? Why would anyone want to threaten you? Do you know anyone missing a left hand? The answers in that order are no, don't know, and I think that's something I'd remember. Needless to say, the Kent police have taken the hand, the can, and the reel of film away for further analyses, and I'm only left with questions and a strange odour in my house I can't seem to shift. Elle reckons, and I tend to agree, that the hand had been severed about 30-ish years ago, judging from the rate of decomposition. The film can must have been quite airtight. The strip of film clutched in the poor victim's hand was a clip from the banquet scene in Viktor Crowe's Mask of the Vampire. Unfortunately, Elle's phone has been taken as evidence, so I can't post the pics just yet. But rest assured, when they are returned to us, I will put them up on my website. The only way to solve a mystery like this is with the help of you deadheads. We can't do this on our own, and any clues to the identity of the sender of this mysterious package would be greatly appreciated. I'd love to know if I'm next on some deranged killer's hit list, or if it's just a horror fan who didn't know the can contained more than just film. Until then, I should probably give the uninitiated a little more context about the forgotten horror legend Viktor Crowe in a section I have called Viktor Crowe, the man behind the monsters. From the late 1950s to the mid-1970s was a truly golden era for horror cinema, especially here in Britain. Birthed by Hammer Studios' science fiction meets horror adaptation of Nigel Neal's The Quatermass Experiment. Other studios soon took up the baton, like Amicus Productions with their twisted portmanteau horrors and the Humboldt-funded Corvus Call Pictures that blended art house with bloodbaths. This period also gave us horror icons, the likes of the statuesque Christopher Lee with his chilling portrayal of Dracula and tragic version of The Mummy, his oft foil in horror, Peter Cushing, playing vampire hunters or crazed scientists, Vincent Price with his silky gothic voice breathing life into the works of Edgar Allan Poe. But what of the forgotten horror voices? I've already mentioned Corvus Call Pictures, but how many of you have seen or even heard any of their extraordinary 10-film run from 1959 to 1975? Each one lovingly crafted by the horror auteur Viktor Crowe. Viktor's art and love of Gothic horror was drawn not just from his twisted imagination, but from his past. Born Vladimir Petrov Cerny, 13th of July 1938, to Novakova and Matyas, he spent his first few years in war-torn Czechoslovakia. Viktor grew up among the rolling hills and walnut groves of Orechov, a small farming village in Moravia. But in 1939, Czechoslovakia was occupied by Germany, and Viktor's village fell under the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. During this tragic time, The Gestapo and Wehrmacht maintained control through informants and brutal reprisals. Farmers had to surrender quotas of grain and livestock to the Reich, leaving Orechov families close to starvation, especially young Victor's. Matthias kept his head down, did as he was told, and handed over his quotas. He only thought of his family and hoped that compliance would keep them safe. His wife didn't feel the same. Novakova heard rumours of Czech resistance fighters hiding in forests around Orechov, and a chance meeting with a wounded resistance fighter quickly led Novakova to a resistance of her own. As the Nazis intensified their crackdown on resistance activity in Moravia and the surrounding villages, Novakova joined a cell that smuggled intelligence and supplies to partisans in the nearby Sudanitsky forest. She kept this secret from Matthias, part of her fearing that if he found out, he would turn her in. On the night of the 5th of October 1943, whilst 5-year-old Viktor slept in his bed, German forces raided his family's farm and dragged his mother, weeping and screaming, off into the night. The following morning, Novakova and 10 others that were part of the same resistance cell were taken out and shot in the village square as a warning to the rest. Viktor later wrote about that life-changing moment in his near-impossible-to-find out-of-print autobiography, Monster Man.
To this day, I still do not know if my own father was the one responsible for my mother's death. He did not side with the Nazis, but he never lifted a finger to fight back. To him, life carried on as normal. He rose at dawn, tended the farm, handed over his grain to the enemy and went back to bed to repeat the same story the next day. It turned my mother's stomach, his lack of fight. She could never stand idly by as she saw her friends and neighbors beaten, starved, and killed, all in the name of the Führer. Even when she was taken by the Nazis, my father just went out into the fields and tilled the earth. Unattended, I snuck out to the village, trudging over well-trodden mud paths, cutting through the small copse of trees behind the village church, and hiding behind a low stone wall that overlooked the village square. They marched out my mother and a group of other partisans onto the cobbled square, just as the village was waking up. They wanted this to be the first thing they saw. I wanted to run to her. I wanted to scream, but my body would not move. My cold fingers dug into the stone wall in front of me as I peered over the top. Even in her final moments, shivering in her nightgown on that grey autumn day, my mother looked like the bravest person I had ever seen. As the soldiers took aim, I clenched my eyes tight shut, and my ears thundered with the familiar crack, crack, crack of gunfire. I did not look. Even at 5 years old, I had the sense to realize that what I wanted to remember was that brave woman standing for what she believed in, standing at the end of a rifle and not wilting. They took my mother from me that day, but inside me was born a fiery passion for never turning a blind eye, for seeking out and exposing humanity's deepest, darkest horrors. I feel I can play all manner of monsters because I have come face to face with the worst the world has to offer.
Whether this account is completely true, Viktor after all is a storyteller, it paints a powerful picture. What do the ravages of war do to a young mind, especially one such as Viktor's? The answer lies in what he did next. After the war, in 1945, Czechoslovakia fell under Soviet control. Still mourning the loss of his mother and unwilling to live under the boot of another regime, Viktor turned inward and became lost in his imagination. He immersed himself in folklore, conjuring monstrous creatures that stalked the forests surrounding his village. As a teenager, he staged puppet shows in the village hall, disturbing the adults but delighting the children. In one tale, rabid wolfmen invaded a village and tore sheep apart, with vivid streams of red silk pulled from the puppets. As Viktor's notoriety grew, the rural folk became unsettled by this strange, gangly teen and his macabre stories. His father ignored him, tending to the land with more devotion than to his son. Resentment over Novakova's death festered into estrangement, and, aged 15, Viktor packed up his puppet theatre and left the walnut groves of Orychov for Prague. He never saw his father again. Prague's Gothic spires, Baroque churches, and winding medieval streets was the canvas Viktor had been searching for. But in 1953, in the wake of Stalin's death, it was a city divided. On the surface, communist rule meant rationing, fear, and the flash of the red scarves of the pioneers. Had Viktor simply traded one prison for another? Yet there was another Prague, one alive in smoky cafes and shadowy theatre basements, where forbidden art and illegal jazz hinted at a freer world, the world Viktor longed for. Here, in a small puppet theatre by the Vltava, Viktor found not only work, but his voice. His strange, Gothic horror shows earned applause rather than fear or confusion, and soon he set aside the puppets and took to the stage himself. In half-legal productions of Faust, Macbeth, and Frankenstein, Viktor found comfort behind the masks. He always insisted on playing the monsters, and those who saw him perform marvelled at how he could breathe life into these creatures. With a subtle shift of posture, or the tilt of his head, he transformed them into tragic figures full of depth and humanity. This young exile from Orychov had at last found peace under theatre lights and grease paint. But his world, for the second time, was about to be shattered. Theatre in 1950s Prague was never safe. Informants hid in the crowd. Secret police attended performances. On another tragic night, they came for Viktor's theatre troupe. While they rehearsed an adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, penned by Viktor himself, the doors and his world came crashing down. His fellow actors were grabbed and voices silenced in Pankrat's prison. Viktor only escaped as he was crouched under a trapdoor, waiting for his big arrival at the end of Act 1. After the raid, Viktor emerged into a cold and empty theatre. At 18 years old, his new family was gone, and Prague could no longer be his stage. If he was to survive, he would have to become someone else, somewhere else. But he was good at that. Only one thing stood in his way: the Iron Curtain. I'll let the horror master tell the tale of his impossible escape in another excerpt from Monster Man.
I knew I had to escape, but the borders were heavily guarded and everyone knew legal immigration was near impossible. I'd heard of smugglers slipping hopefuls through forests and over fields to freedom, but I did not want to end up in prison like my friends. I knew if I was to succeed, I would have to rely on my own talents, and, standing in that dark theater on that fateful night, I realized I had everything I needed for my escape. I would not leave as Vladimir Petrov Cerny, but as Viktor Crowe, a wandering, sickly minstrel traveling from town to town with his puppet show. I donned a false nose, painted my skin pale and gaunt, walked with a limp, and hid myself under the dark robe I wore portraying Frankenstein's creature. My old wolfman puppet hung from my belt as my alibi and companion on this fateful journey. I would have to perform an escape, as I knew if I tried to flee as the frightened Vladimir, I would be arrested at the very first crossing. I set out that very night as the newly created Viktor Crowe. At the Znojmo border, I mumbled and croaked a tale of being separated from my troop in the chaos of the city. I coughed as though I had the plague and made my wolfman puppet dance for the guards' amusement. Maybe they didn't want to catch what they thought I had, maybe they thought me mad, maybe they believed me, but they let me pass. Over the border, the forests of Austria stretched out before me, but this was only the first step of my escape. I slept during the day and wandered forward at night. With each step, I perfected Viktor Crowe's gait, practiced his husky tones. By the time I reached Vienna, I'd forgotten who Vladimir Petrov Cerney even was. In the displaced persons camp of Vienna, I found sanctuary. I performed my puppet show for wide-eyed children and skeptical guards. They saw me as an oddity, an eccentric, a lost performer in search of a troupe. In the camps, many did not have official papers, only an oral testimony of who they were. I saw my chance. As I faced the officials seeking my passage to England, I treated it like an audition. The show? A life in Great Britain. I rid myself of the plague I had pretended to have on my long trudge to Vienna, and now presented Viktor Crowe as a young, healthy, fit man willing to dig, hole and labor. My childhood on the farm was finally paying off. Maybe father would have been proud, seeing me play the farmer he had long wanted me to be. I got the role. They gave me my papers, shipped me off to a port where I awaited passage to my new stage. As I boarded the boat for England, I realized Vladimir had died in the East. Viktor Crowe would live in the West.
Victor arrived on Tilbury Docks, England on November the 27th, 1956. Only 3 short years later, he would stun the horror world by writing, directing and starring in his first feature film, Mask of the Vampire. But that story involves a murder, a chance meeting, and a stuffed monkey dressed as a harlequin. What did I tell you? How can a man like that, a man like Viktor Crowe, be forgotten? And that is only the start of his extraordinary life. Next time, I'm diving deep into the film that... Elle, can you answer that?
Why have I got to do it?
Because I'm in the middle of recording a podcast.
Dad, fucking answer it yourself. Fuck's sake, Jesus.
Yeah, that is some lovely language, sweetheart. Yes, this is Gavin Tripplehorn. Yes, Detective Ward, I'm listening. Is this about the hand? Wait a minute. I would never. You don't understand. It just turned up at my door. Blank envelope, no address, not even my name. But if you could just... Hello? Hello? Was this on the whole time? Sorry, Crypt Creepers. A little bonus content there. I'm in a bit of shock, to be honest. That was the Kent police on the phone. It seems our severed hand case was handed over, no pun intended, to a Detective Sergeant Ward. They managed to get partial fingerprints off the rotting digits, and were about to run them through the criminal database when they noticed the prints were a match for some other fingerprints they'd already taken. It would appear the severed hand is mine.
Gavin's Graveyard Gold is a Weirdworks production featuring Daniel Carter-Hope as Gavin Tripplehorn, Megan Carter as Elvira Tripplehorn, recorded, mixed and edited at 5A Studios, written and directed by Paul Williams.